Hi, everybody, it's Cory. Thanks for joining me again on this Monday as we unpack a little bit and have a short devotion. This Sunday, we talked about time and we talked about how to make the most of your time and the most of your life and how to redeem your time. Micah talked about that a little bit. That reminded me of a passage in the Bible from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Now, Ecclesiastes is kind of this philosophical book where it unpacks what is meaningful in life and therefore how should we live. And it really sets the table to our need for Jesus. So you can read Ecclesiastes in its entirety sometime, and it can be a little bit of a discouraging read, but at the same time there's so much truth there, and it leads us to Jesus. I encourage you to read that. But I want to take a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. And you would have heard these verses before, maybe at a funeral or maybe in some other occasion. But here's what it says. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry, a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Well, that passage is absolutely full of contrasts, right? Opposites. So it takes each event of life and it talks about the good and it talks about the polar opposite. And it reminds us that life's full of opposites and that you never know what's going to happen. And this passage has often been talked about as a kind of an introduction for us to think about God's plans and God's timing on things. But really, more than anything, it points to how unexpected life can change, how it can turn south at a moment's notice. And I know that all of you know what we're talking about, whether it is a sickness, whether it's a relationship, whether it is even a death, right? Life can turn south so quickly, right? It's up and down and up and down. And that brings about a lot of questions like around, is God in control? And how much does God care? It leads us to question, how much can we trust God? And how involved is God in our lives? And of course, I'm really interested in what you think about that, because philosophers and even people who love Jesus have been tossing that around for thousands of years. And how much do we control in our lives? That's what this passage reminds us about in the ups and downs of life. Everything can be planned, it seems like. So if you take a look at Psalm 139, and this is a beloved passage for a lot of people. It speaks about God's love and intimate knowledge of our lives. And then it makes a statement in verse 16, talking to God. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. And so that passage seems to indicate that God plans everything out to the last detail and makes us wonder, well, what's our role? But then you get other passages in the Bible, like in Genesis chapter 18, where God's having this back and forth with Abraham as Abraham prays that the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah could be saved and rescued and the people there spared. And there's this back and forth with God. It seems like a partnership. Well, however you land on those questions, I think that we can say, here are a couple things we really know. First of all, God's not coercive. He doesn't force us to do stuff that's totally against our free will. Now, of course, many of you would say, well, God can shape us and move us in directions. So, but at the same time, we have a choice. We have free will. But then on the other side, that the other thing we could say with absolute certainty is that God is free, that God's perfect, that God can do anything, and he's free to act and he's acting in this world, right? It's what God is doing that really matters to us who follow Jesus. Well, let's turn back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and let's unpack a little bit in terms of the verses there. Some of them are really self-explanatory. It talks about birth, and it talks about death. Of course, joyful birth, right? And who, when they haven't been in that delivery room, you can't deny God in there, right? It's like there's so much joy and life is so precious. And at the same time, we've all walked through the heartache with maybe in our own families or with their friends of someone passing. And there's this sense of hushed awe that as we think about that this life is so short and what's next and what will happen when we meet God. There's talking about a time to plant and a time to harvest. Now that can speak to good times and hard times. It means if you keep on going, a time to kill, a time to heal. Now, I don't think kill means to murder. I think it's probably speaking about war, like it talks about later, a time for war and a time for peace. That's just the way that life is. God doesn't want war, but I mean, it happens, right? People have conflict with one another. In verse 3, a time to tear down and a time to build up. That can speak about construction or can speak about our own lives, a time to start something and a time to end it and a time to give up on it. Verse 4, a time to cry and a time to laugh. And I wonder in your life right now, what's going on? Is this a crying time, a laughing time, or somewhere in between? Time to grieve, time to dance. Again, goes right alongside of that. Verse 5, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. And that's either talking about farming, where you're picking up stones from the field so that you can get ready for planting, or maybe somebody who sabotages your field, and or maybe it's something that you owned and you scatter stones there to wreck the field. Or it could speak about building, time to build with stones, or a time to rip it all down and start from foundation. Verse number 6, time to search, a time to quit searching, a time to keep, time to throw away. Wow, I wish we could have that kind of wisdom and knowing that, right? Because we have so much in our lives. Would it be great if we had great wisdom in knowing when to keep something and when to throw it away? And I wonder what you're like. Do you find it hard to throw away things or easier to keep them? Or are you easily parted with the things that you have? Number 7, a time to tear and a time to mend. And that's probably talking in terms of clothing, right? How do clothes have their time, and sometimes they need to be turned into rags. Also could be talking about mourning, because people would rip their clothing in a time of mourning. So it could be speaking about that as well. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. Wow, that's maybe the hardest one, right? Knowing when at least as it relates to us and our control and our wisdom over our lives, when to be quiet and when to speak. Oh, we need God's wisdom on that one. Time to love, a time to hate. That's speaking about relationships and how quickly they can turn south, right? They're very unpredictable and up and down. Time for war and a time for peace. Well, bringing this all to, like, what does that mean for your life and what does it mean for my life? Then two things. Number one, in the face of such unpredictability when it comes to life, how life is such a roller coaster of ups and downs. First of all, to manage your frustrations. See, there's this futility. It's like, does it even matter what I do? And I've known a lot of people who have kind of said, hey, I'm not going to follow God anymore, because it doesn't seem to matter. If I follow God, that doesn't mean my life seems rosy, or it doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to me, so I'm just going to live the way that I want to live. That's frustration. And maybe you've been there at some point. It's like, why bother even following God? Well, don't give up. Manage those frustrations. You've got limitations. That doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. It doesn't mean that God isn't involved in your life and care about you. And it doesn't mean that things are always going to be that way. And it doesn't mean that that's the end and that you should lose hope. So manage your frustrations. And right alongside of that, the second thing is, how can you turn to trust in God through the ups and downs of life? How can you trust God through the ups and downs of life? And I like to think about making certain shifts, right? The first one is from blaming God, which is kind of self-defeating in a way. Now, God's shoulders are big enough to it, and you'll even see people in the Bible who blame God. But that's not where they landed. It's where they started, it's not where they landed. Blaming God versus wrestling with God. There's a big difference. Blaming God is just like end scene. That's it. It's just a one-sided conversation where we're blaming God. Wrestling with God's more like Jacob, Israel did, right? Where he wasn't going to let go of God. He was going to work this out with God and wrestle with him. Big difference. Wrestling is trust in God. From also too accepting. On the other side, blaming is kind of this dead end, but also just accepting without doing anything. Just saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter what I do. God's just going to work it out. And though that may be true and that may work in some situations, there's a big difference between just accepting everything that happens and praying and acting for change. Just because what you see now is happening doesn't mean that's where God wants it to be. And that doesn't mean that's your end point. What's God calling you to do? Wrestle with God in prayer. That's my encouragement for today. I don't know what's going on in your life right now, whether things are north or whether things are south. What time it is in your life, like the time things that were indicated in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. But God's with you. I know that. God is powerful. He can change things. And that God is working toward your very best deep in your soul. Anyway, take care. Love to hear from you anytime. Other than that, I'll see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye for now.